All right, so I enjoy games just as much as the next person. I play video games, I play board games, I go to LARP. It's a lot of fun, and I do it because it's sometimes good to escape reality. You know, I get up every day, I go to work, you know, I do my thing. I want to have a little bit of fun, and my reality I escape through video games, through board games, through tabletop, through LARPing. And now I can't open up a fucking newspaper. I can't go online. I can't look through my Facebook feeds or any of my other social media without hearing how much of a dick and a terrible person I am because I enjoy these games that are super offensive because they're culturally appropriating people's culture and they're making fun of this and they're saying that people are evil and bad. And you know what? Fuck you, because I'm not a bad person. I'm a good person. I pay my taxes. I do all of this shit. I do what I'm supposed to do, and I just want to have a good time. I want to have fun. And now you're telling me that I'm the scum of the earth because I'm enjoying these fucking games. Take your social justice shit and shove it up your ass. Take it out of my fun because I enjoy these. I'm not a bad person, and fuck you for thinking that I am.
So we've all heard someone make an argument like this before, and let's be honest, there are things that we learn as we go. None of us come fully formed knowing how to be sensitive to other cultures that we're not familiar with. We don't know where the line is necessarily, and what we can do is we learn. And as we learn, we can say, wow, maybe sometimes we cross the line.
Well, the first thing I want to say is that I don't believe anything that I just said in that rant.
100%.
Okay.
Neither of us do, but we've heard those arguments.
Oh, yeah. And the question, the reason why we posed this question to you who's listening and to the gaming community, which we're gonna get into in a few.
Yeah, and to the internet.
Yeah, to the community at large in the internets. The thing is, we posed the question because honestly, we want to get a sense of one, how people feel about cultural appropriation, what they actually think about it. Two, do they even know what the hell it means?
Yeah, are they aware that it's going on?
Right.
And it's going on whether it's. I don't think anyone intends to do it.
Right. And
people write things that are influenced. They don't realize that. You know, maybe they're taking liberties they shouldn't. Right,
and the third point, which I think is really important, is once you figure out and realize, okay, this is happening, what should we do about it? That for me is I think the big takeaway from asking this question. So we posed this question to the gaming community, obviously through social media, the interwebs, all that good stuff. Because we wanted to get a sense from folks who game in one form or another, especially LARP, live action role playing, because not only is that a community that we are very close to, but there tends to be because there is a strong element of storytelling within that game. You do find that some of these games actually have cultural appropriation built into them. Also tabletop as well.
Yeah, and it's not in ways that you might readily think of, because these are themes that are sort of ubiquitous almost at this point. If you look at just the genre of the Wild West, which we've talked about, we talked about Deadlands.
Which is actually the inspiration for this episode.
Yeah, we had a discussion with some of our friends. We talked about Deadlands as a Wild West, Weird West game, and we got a comment from a friend of yours.
Yep. Dr. Amanda Morris, and she was actually, one of the things that she mentioned in her comment was that it was sad to hear about all this Native American cultural appropriation in the game.
And her background is literally in like Native American rhetoric.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
Indigenous rhetorics, yeah. And that was the thing. It was like I answered her, I responded to her comment, and it really got me to thinking.
Yeah,
like,
and it got us to talking about it because I'm very vocal in that episode. I really like that game. But she's right. It's taking aspects of Native American culture and sort of minimizing them and not in any way doing anything to highlight the realities of those situations. It, glosses over things such as like the Trail of Tears,
right?
Which is a huge moment in American history.
Yeah.
But what it comes down to is there are games, the entire genre of cowboys and Indians. Look at the Lone Ranger and Tonto.
Yep.
Like, these are stories that we know that are part of, at least here in the U.S., they're part of our history, that are a part of media in the U.S., that are part of the storytelling that has been going on for generations.
Yeah, growing up, I loved the Lone Ranger. And of course, when you're a kid, especially when you're a kid, you don't realize these subtle things, these images and stories that are being told.
Or the way that the stories are just presented, that it's just, this person is, an Indian, which at this point, I think all of us know that referring to an Indian in that, air quotes way, it's not appropriate for a number of reasons.
Yeah.
But it goes much deeper than just that. Just referring to a native person as one of that thing that is native people is to minimize the diversity that's there. Same thing in any number of other ways. You can look at other media, you can look at other games that exist out in our community that reference things that are not, in an enlightened world appropriate, that are doing a disservice and in some ways actually diminishing and hurting the cultural groups that it's referring to. There are ways to take this sort of, the ideas that we want to highlight and do them correctly and do them well and show them respect.
But Skinny Guy, I love this game and it's not offensive to me. Like, why should I care? I ask as if I don't care, but I do.
Yeah, because just because you could do something easily and you could perhaps do something shitty in the process, you could also do something equally enjoyable and do something positive in the process. You could take these missteps that we might not even realize we're making, and you can look at them and we can understand that, hey, maybe we're making some missteps and there's ways that we can improve our community and we can improve the way that we experience these games and these stories and make it better, and to highlight some of these people that are diminished, some of these cultures that are diminished and downplayed, and really show that there's an incredible diversity, not just in the gaming community, but in the world and in all this media that we love to consume.
Absolutely. Most people don't know. They have different ideas about what cultural appropriation really is. Cultural appropriation is a concept dealing with the adoption of the elements of a minority culture by members of the dominant culture. It is distinguished from equal cultural exchange due to the presence of a colonial element and imbalance of power. So right there in the definition, let's try and break that down a little bit.
Let's stick to the Lone Ranger analogy.
Yeah, perfect.
I think that's a real simple one. So we've got the Lone Ranger, our good guy hero, white man in a mask, who's got his native sidekick, who is a mystical native person. He's the noble savage, which you're going to hear that term come up again.
Yeah.
What?
I hate that term.
Yeah.
But I understand where it comes from. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's the trope, and we'll come back to tropes as well. That exists. It's minimizing of native people to lump them all together into this. It's like, oh no, but we're saying that he's so good and he's helping the Lone Ranger and he's necessary and he's important. It's like, well, yeah, because of these generalities that you're just sort of taking liberties with. You're taking these aspects of a culture without actually representing the truth of that culture, the reality.
Exactly. And again, it comes from, if you're looking at that definition, it comes from an imbalance of power. So basically, someone who has the power essentially to make these ideas, to make these changes, to introduce these ideas to society at large, whether it's through entertainment, through history books, whatever it is. They have that ability to pick and choose, kind of like a real fucked up buffet line, okay, and just say, hey, here are the aspects that we want you to focus on about this culture. They're not giving you the culture as a whole. They're giving it to you like this really weird, like perfect example, the noble savage.
Yeah, Tonto is helping the Lone Ranger do good. Tonto isn't the one doing good. He's able to help the Lone Ranger.
Right, but what was Tonto's life? Is his life just helping the Lone Ranger? But doesn't he have like specific needs in his life, or what's going on with his personal struggle, his personal journey? You don't know, because
he's busy helping the Lone Ranger.
His life is defined by the Lone Ranger, right? And if that doesn't scream, I have power over this culture, and you're going to do what I say, and your life is defined by my actions and not your own, I don't know what does. So, I mean, obviously these are our personal thoughts on what but we wanted to know what other people thought, you know? So what we did was, like I said before, we scoured social media. We went on the Facebook and, was it the MyFace and the Spacebook, right? And
the Tweetbook and the MyFace.
And all the social medias. And, and we asked folks those questions. We asked them, you know, what they thought cultural appropriation was, and what can we do if we find there's a game that is doing that. So I'm going to pull up right now the Facebook stuff. So some of the responses that we got when we posted to Facebook were pretty positive, in the sense that folks are definitely, the folks that we reached out to were definitely aware of what cultural appropriation was, and what they, you know, taking steps in their specific, like their little community of whether it's tabletop, whether it's LARP, whether it's video games. And some of the responses were pretty good. I mean, one person, she put down, she actually made a list of it looks like 5 things. It's like, the first thing, if you think it might be appropriation, it probably fucking is. 2, if you're taking an idea from a culture, talk to someone of that culture and see what they have to say about it. It's
one of the big things
important
that we're going to keep coming back to during the discussion.
Absolutely. I mean, if you should not be writing a story or creating a game around a culture that you have zero experience in, or you're not even part of that culture. You really, not only should you be doing the due diligence of doing your research, but you should be talking to people from that culture, so you're doing it justice. You're actually getting that input and making it as rich as possible.
You're delivering correct information.
Absolutely. 3, if you are white, for fuck's sake, talk to people of color. I mean, that's
sort of a reiteration of number 2, but worth reiterating.
Yes.
Talk to someone of that culture that you're going to be presenting information about.
Yep. Number 4, again, she was, I love this because it's a lot of reiteration, which is definitely what people need. Number 4, if you think you're done writing or creating, looks like it's time to talk to some people of color. Again, that's what you got to do. And 5, think you're done reviewing? Whoops, you're not. So you go right back to number 1, essentially.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's how I would caveat that. I was like that. And number 5 is go back to number 1. Just keep doing that over and over again, because really,
if you think you've done your due diligence, I guarantee you, if you're talking about a culture that you have no experience with, you haven't.
Yep.
You don't have a lifetime of experience, which other people do. Yeah. You're going to make mistakes. That's not because you're trying to be malicious, necessarily. You could just not realize that you've got something wrong.
Hell, you might actually be coming up with an idea based on a trope. And based on that trope, you're actually doing harm to that culture. So you really, again, you need to talk to people from that culture. You need to be doing that due diligence. And we're going to be posting some links also, because there's some, we found some links. And again, thanks to our community. And I'm just going to shout out real quick to Kate because I know she doesn't care. But she actually sent us some links to articles about, for example, let's talk about the fantasy world of tabletop and Lord of the Rings and such, as like, for example, like dark elves.
And we touch on it lightly when we're talking to Amanda, but the whole idea of Forgotten Realms Drow, as they're known, they are obsidian-skinned, white-haired, tunnel-dwelling, evil,
like inherently
elves.
evil, like just because they are from that race, they are all supposedly evil.
Yeah, like one of the most famous Forgotten Realms characters is a Drow who is a good guy, and that's his biggest. He's the one who's good.
Right, that, and like the only one.
Yeah, but the entire idea of like the evil, dark-skinned, tunnel-dwelling, primitive,
right,
so on and so forth. You're just taking ideas of. You're just taking sort of negative, stereotypical aspects of the other culture that is bad.
Right.
And you're putting them on this like fantasy theme, except you're really making allusions to what could very easily be referenced to specific cultures by some people that want to.
Let's just call it what it is. It's all
it's blackface.
Yeah, it's blackface, but it's also all dark skinned people are evil.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's really what it is. The other article is about orcs. How, because again, if you're familiar with Forgotten Realms, how dumb and stupid and
tribal
but not only that, it's a direct reference to Mongolia and all of those and the cultures from there. So again, we're going to put these the links to these articles up so you can read, you can make up your own mind, but. They make really good, valid points as to, okay, these are things. It doesn't matter if it's fantasy. All stories, all fantasy is based loosely in reality.
Yeah, these ideas come from somewhere.
Once you understand that, this is where it came from, you're never going to look at it the same way again. So it's really important for you to again, do your due diligence and make sure you know what's going on. Whether you're your first time playing a game or you've been playing a game for years, take a look at it, see exactly is this a problem? Is this an issue? And then kind of go from there.
So we did get a response that was more or less one of the things that you said in the rant, which was, keep your social justice out of my fun. Yeah,
that was my my very favorite, going onto Reddit. I went onto Reddit and I posed that question also, mostly to the LARP community. And I'll be very honest. So the response was very mixed. You had some folks who were basically saying the same things that you and I are saying right now, which is, there's some games that realize that they have been cultural appropriating these different cultures for a while, and they're now making the changes.
Yeah, and let's be clear. We've made reference to a couple of things, and some of those companies are actively taking steps to correct.
Oh, absolutely,
what they see.
Yeah, they've listened, they've heard, especially Wizards of the Coast.
Yeah, they've made a number of moves in Magic the Gathering to be more inclusive. I believe they're doing similar things in their Dungeons & Dragons license.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. But when talking with the LARP folks on the Reddit forum, it was very mixed. You had some folks who the cultural appropriation in my game, we're taking steps to fix it, or the folks who are running it are taking steps.
Yeah, we realize now that using the term gypsy is not okay.
Yeah.
So we're taking that stereotypical, reading the future in cards and traveling in caravans and jangles and bright colors, Romani style stereotype, and we're not using that anymore.
Yeah, but then you had the other side, which was more along the side of my rant, which is actually where a lot of that came from, where some of them, some of them had very well thought out, like they thought about their answer before they answered me on the forum, and they took their time with it. And however, it was very much, why are you trying to take my fun away from me? And why are you injecting all of this social justice stuff to the game? The games are not racist. The games are fantasy. They're not reality. We don't see that there's a problem with this. Some of them went even so far as to say, this is the way these games are, and my game is this way, and they're not going to change. And I even asked the question, I was like, okay, well, aren't you afraid, one, of offending people, and two, if you offend enough people that you'll actually, I came at it from a business perspective. I said, if you offend enough people, do you think that will affect your business, your game as a business? And I was told by a number of different people that no, I think that if they're offended, they're not going to want to play my game, and there's other games that they can play, and that's the market, and more power to them. They weren't going to cater to these social justice warriors who want to come in and ruin fun. And they weren't being mean or nasty. I think they were just coming from a place of...
They didn't want to put in the legwork.
Yeah, one, they didn't want to put in the legwork. Two, I honestly, if I had to guess, I would probably say it also had to do with a lack of understanding. Like they,
yes.
Like they, some folks just need to have that conversation.
So let me just say something real fast. In everything we talked about, one thing that I think needs to be highlighted is you could be playing a game that culturally appropriates. That does not mean, or watching a movie or whatever that does this. That does not mean that it was intentionally maliciously doing so.
Mm-hmm.
It simply means that someone didn't realize the diminishing effect that their actions can have.
Right.
That they're taking something from a culture without giving something back because they have an audience.
Right.
They're taking, I like this aspect of what this culture is, has, and I'm going to highlight that, but not show anything else.
Right.
I'm going to boil that entire culture down to this aspect. And, isn't it good that I'm showing that culture? Well, it's good that you're attempting to, but you're not actually showing that culture.
Yeah, you're showing a piece of that culture, and not even the whole piece.
Simply because, we're calling this out doesn't mean the people that have this in their games, that are playing games with this in it, you're not bad.
Yeah,
You are doing something that could be better. We want to help you recognize that this is an aspect of the hobby, of media, of all sorts of different parts of our lives that exist.
Yep.
And we want you to learn to spot it, to realize, hey, I could take the time to maybe not just boil this down to a stereotype.
Mm-hmm.
I could learn something about that culture. I could engage with that culture.
Yeah.
I could improve myself by having a more diverse view of the world and the people around me.
Yeah.
That's really what we're talking about.
Yeah, because I'll be very honest. Like there was, I was trying to be as open as I possibly could with the forum, because I didn't want them to think that, hey, this guy's just kind of poking the hornet's nest here, mm-hmm. and he's going to make us look bad, which is actually, someone actually called me out on that forum saying that that's what I was just there for, which I was only there to stir things up and call people out and make them look like pieces of shit, and that I should go fuck myself. And
with our vast powers to do anything.
Yeah. So the reality.
Thank you for listening, listeners.
Yes, but and that's the thing. I was really there. I wanted to learn. I wanted to find out why people thought one way or the other. It's like, I know how I feel about this situation.
We're not experts. We're asking into the void.
Yeah.
And this is what we're seeing.
Yeah, since we started this episode, how we feel about the situation, but I want to understand the other side of it. I want to know, how does everybody think the way I do, or if they don't think the way I do, what's driving them, what's motivating them to think that way. I want to understand, I want to know that. And I even said it there. I was like, I'm not looking to call anybody out. We're not calling out people by name. We're not calling out games. We want to keep this conversation going. It's about growing. It's about learning and moving forward. Because honestly, look, we love gaming. That's why we do this podcast. One of the main reasons we do this podcast is to help better the community. And in asking these questions,
this is a shortcoming that exists.
Mm-hmm.
There's aspects of, I'm sure, many games that you might not have at first blush realized, oh, well, that's really just sort of taking this aspect of this culture and just using it for yourself.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it's okay, though, because it's a fantasy race that I made up, and I took that aspect. Well, you're taking something from that culture.
Yeah. You're doing an injustice to that culture, especially if you didn't talk to somebody. If they had zero input, if someone from that culture had zero input on that character, on that race, then you have basically said, I'm an expert on this, and I have. I
don't know that I would go that far.
Well, in some cases,
you're claiming control over it,
right?
At the very least.
Yes, and claiming that control, you're doing a disservice to other people. So you have to ask yourself a couple of questions. You have to ask yourself, am I doing this? One, I think you actually hit the nail on the head. Am I doing this because I'm lazy? Right?
Yeah.
And it's just easier to write a story this way. Two, do I actually care about the other culture? Because I'll be very honest, some responses that we got were just, it was very clear they didn't care about
or even
outside cultures.
Or even to the effect of, why should I care?
Right, exactly.
And
it doesn't affect me, so why should I care? And I think that is the most dangerous mentality in my opinion, because if you're basically saying, I don't give a shit about the person sitting next to me, especially if they're not the same culture that I am.
Right. It's not just that you're saying, well, you don't matter, because that's if you really want to boil this subject down, that's what you're saying. So I don't care.
Right.
Is what you're saying. What we're saying is, why wouldn't you care?
Mm-hmm.
Why would you want to lose that unique viewpoint? Why wouldn't you want to have a unique voice in the world to come at any subject from a unique perspective to yourself? Why would you want to limit everything to one particular way of thinking? That's not how learning and growth happens.
Right.
Growth happens through diversity, through discovery, through discussion, through debate. We're not saying you can't do this, because people are going to continue to appropriate, and they're going to take ideas with the best intentions, and they'll get it wrong, or with the worst and shittiest intentions, and they'll make millions of dollars.
Right. Exactly.
All these things are going to continue to happen. All we are trying to say is, open your mind. Think about these things. Think about the world around you and how you interact with it. Think about those cultures and what they might have to offer that you don't know they have to offer. So we've gone sort of long. We might do this as a two-part episode at this point. That's up to the old man to decide.
Yep.
But if not, this is where we're going to send you over to the interview with Amanda.
Yep.
It was eye-opening for me. It was very educational and informative, and I hope it will be for all of you.
Absolutely. So just sit back and relax, and here's the interview with Dr. Amanda Morris. Thank you so much again for giving us a part of your Sunday.
You're welcome.
We appreciate it. We're here with Dr. Amanda Morris. She is an associate professor of writing and rhetoric at Kutztown University and a scholar of contemporary indigenous rhetorics. She currently serves as chapter president for the faculty union APSCUF, which we are somewhat familiar with.
Just a little bit.
Just a little. And a co-host and produce the Insight 254 podcast, which we talk about occasionally on the show.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
You were one of the earliest people that were giving us advice.
Yeah, absolutely. And,
Happy to help.
And to relax, she loves playing Skyrim and working in her garden, so we just brought it all around back to gaming.
All right, perfect. Nailed it. Got it in one.
Yeah. So thank you for sitting down with us, and also for being the inspiration for us actually doing this interview.
Thank you very much for asking me to be on your show. I really appreciate the chance to talk about cultural appropriation and the issues with Native peoples today with a broader audience. You know, that's something our latest podcast, we did a myth-busting episode on Native Americans, and this just expands the audience for that conversation, I think, in a way that makes sense to your audience. It's gaming, but it's still relevant. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, so this entire idea started to sit down with you when you made a comment on the episode about Deadlands, which is, as if anyone listens to that, one of my favorite tabletop games. But you pointed out, it's upsetting that there seems to be so much Native American cultural appropriation involved in it. And really there is. Yeah, we briefly sort of this game was made in the 90s, it's not really the most politically correct. And then you just made a very simple comment about it, and it really got, the old man and I talking.
Oh yeah, it definitely did.
I'm so glad.
Yeah,
That's great.
and because I did...
you never know when those comments are just going to be out there in the ether, or if somebody's actually paying attention, so thank you.
Trust us, we read every comment.
That's great.
But yeah, it was... I responded to the comment, but... It didn't, for me, it didn't stop there. Like, it was just like, I made that and I was like, no, this is a much bigger problem than just this game, So
right. This is something that shows up in various games, various other forms of media, just in our culture.
It's everywhere.
Yeah. It's a part of the world.
Right. So let's start with definition of cultural appropriation.
What are we talking about?
Okay. So a basic definition of cultural appropriation would be the taking of a culture that is not your own. Right. So that's very simple. And it could be things like symbols, artifacts, ideas, religion or religious practices, spirituality and practices, clothing, etc., right? So that in and of itself might not be problematic, but it becomes problematic when you add, and especially I'm speaking because my area is Indigenous rhetorics. I'm talking about the effect on Native Americans and representations of Native American peoples.
Right.
So for Native Americans, the idea of cultural appropriation is directly connected to colonialism, and that is where the dominant group in power takes from a group in a marginalized position. Okay. So that then it becomes about erasing a culture, erasing the identity, the real identity of a people. So this is a problem because it's a disconnection from the source. Right. So when you see something, when you see like a native, like the quote noble savage represented in a video game, that is in no way connected to any of the 567 federally recognized real tribes that are in existence today on this land.
I think one of the easiest touchstones for this specific example is, if you've ever been to a costume shop and you see the quote unquote Native American princess or whatever.
Pocahontas.
Yeah.
That's what they call it. Geez. Scantily clad, skimpy fringe, it is encapsulating,
of course, all Native peoples under that umbrella. We're taking something away from them. Also, in that example, just sort of ignoring the diversity that is there and just sort of boiling it down to this thing that we can sell for our own profit.
Right.
That's one of those things that is always in my head as like the classic, this is what cultural appropriation looks like.
Yes. And that's a really good example. I think it's something that everybody can probably relate to because we've all been to those costume stores. You guys do LARPs, right? That's what it's called. I don't do LARPs. I like Skyrim, but I don't do LARPs. But that's okay. I know what it is.
Just think of it. Just think of it as Skyrim for real.
Okay.
Like
so you need costumes, right? Yeah, so in any of those games, you might run into needing a costume, and okay, here we go to the costume store, and right. So I think that's a good point. So the problem is when there's no participation in the development of whatever it is, the game, the movie, the tabletop, the clothing, whatever it is that's being taken. When there's no participation from that marginalized group, from someone from that marginalized group, and there's no benefit, economic or otherwise, to that original marginalized group, that you're creating a real problem on multiple levels. So cultural appropriation very often, I would say, I'd like to say always, but I will just say very often to be fair. It often relies on stereotypes, right? So we can all agree, I think stereotypes, there's always some thread of truth to a stereotype, but here's the problem. Stereotypes are one-dimensional. So it presents a one-dimensional version, and very often a misinformed version of maybe who that culture is, right? So collectively, like putting the whole culture together into one monolithic group, and then going, well, this is who they is. This is who they is. Listen to me. This is who they are. Right. So the idea of a one-dimensional, quote, noble savage, right? That's an example that you see with Native peoples throughout history, throughout literature and games, everything, movies. The problem with a stereotype in this case, it's not the full truth. So you don't get the full dimension of the complex, dynamic, and interesting nature of that culture that you think you're representing. And what I hear a lot, and I know Native people hear this a lot too, is, well, we're honoring you. You're not honoring them. If you're taking and you're misrepresenting, and then you're just taking maybe one little piece and saying this is representative of all of them when it's not even true. So that's cultural appropriation in a nutshell.
Gotcha. So let me perhaps jump ahead to things that we might talk a bit further about. There's the taking of something from another culture to appropriate it. And you're talking about it's lacking that involvement. What is the other side of that? What's the good way to maybe incorporate other cultures into some of these properties that we're working on? Because if you look at all these games that we're talking about, ideas come from all over the place. Sometimes they're cultural, sometimes they have to do with history. What is the right way that we can start looking at these things that we want to include, that we take inspiration from, and correctly sort of incorporate them into how we do these things?
Well, I want to throw in a little monkey wrench to that, because I want to add to that as well. So you have within the gaming community, whether it's video games or LARPs or what have you, you have you have storytellers who are building these worlds, who are building these narratives, and they actually have, for lack of the term, tropes. These tropes, and they use them. It's and everything: video games, TV, what have you, and especially at the LARPs. So using what Brendan was asking, and then you have these tropes. I mean, obviously, my go-to, and we actually put out this question to some of our community, and they were like, one of the first things I heard was, "Don't use tropes. Stop using tropes." I think narrative tropes are good to use, but not these specific cultural tropes.
Identity tropes.
Thank you. Yes.
So someone define trope real fast, just in case anyone listening doesn't know what that is.
It's a how can I put this? It's a common theme. It's something that's
it's something parallel to stereotypes.
Right, it is.
But it's usually dealing with story elements or some kind of narration,
like a motif that's always there. It's a story element that it has become, I hate to say, a cliche.
There you go.
That's. I'm trying to be fair about this, because we do see.
Don't be fair. We're never fair on this show.
And the thing is, I have sympathy. I do.
Yeah.
I understand why people do it. I understand why.
Well, because these are elements to stories that we've grown up with.
Right.
And you have the cultural referent. So if you're saying, well, okay, Lone Ranger and Tonto. Yeah. Well, we're going to create a LARP around Lone Ranger and Tonto. Who knows? Maybe that's already been. I don't know. But so you might have the trope of the noble savage helping sidekick with the with the white man ranger riding the range and righting wrongs in the Western community. Well, that's a problem, because it reduces. Tonto is basically reduced to a stereotype, a stereotyped idea, right? A single element of maybe some of the characteristics of a real Indigenous person. Is that to say that maybe there weren't Native peoples helping the settlers in the West? No, because we have proof that they were. Right. But what we've done in our storytelling, historically and today, is, turn them into a trope, a motif, an element, an easily pluggable idea, right? So you can take these and you plug all these ideas in, and then you have all your characters and you have your settings, and then, okay, go, play.
Then that's your mix.
But here's the thing. So I like trying to amplify Indigenous voices as much as possible. Please, yeah. I want to give you guys a reference if anybody's interested in this, learning more. Elizabeth LaPensée, she's a professor. She's also a video game designer, award-winning Anishinaabe video game designer. She wrote an article for Indian Country Today Media Network, and this was in 2017, but it's very relevant to our conversation today. It's still relevant. In fact, the article is pretty long, and it lists a whole bunch of different Indigenous games that were created by Indigenous game designers, and there's a skins workshop that's called up in Canada for Indigenous game designers to go and learn more about game designing. But the article title is Video Games Encourage Indigenous Cultural Expression. And the one quote I think is relevant here. She says, when done right, video games have the potential for Indigenous people to express themselves on their own terms, right? So this is about moving from cultural appropriation to cultural collaboration, where you're including and involving Native peoples in the story design, embedding that Indigenous identity into the story mechanics, into the game mechanics, into the system. So you're not just plugging a character trope in, right. You're actually including, like, for instance, I'm going to jump ahead here because I think it's relevant.
Yeah, no,
there's no ahead or behind.
So,
it's just what we're going to talk about.
Okay, so the idea of being able to say who you are. I mean, think about, I don't know, maybe this doesn't bother you, but when you see all Italian Americans assumed to be members of the mob, right? That to me is a problem.
Right.
I mean, I'm married to an Italian American man, and he thinks it's funny. And I'm like, well, but you're from that culture. You can think it's funny. If I say it, it's offensive. Right. And we go back and forth about whether that's really true. But that's another idea. That's another trope that's in our culture that we just assume, well, if you're Italian, you must be in the mob. No. And actually, someone said to him, I think on his Facebook page at one point, because we like to cook, and he was making macaroni and gravy. Okay, so for those Italians out there. So he was making us dinner one night, and one of his friends said, well, you're Italian, you better be good at that. And he was like, why would you assume that I'm good at cooking just because I'm Italian? What is that? So that is also, these are these horrible assumptions that we have. So it's not just about Native peoples, but...
It's also interesting, you have to be good at that.
You must.
Yeah.
These things go, they can be seen, quote unquote, as positive, but really they're just misleading.
Yes.
That's really what it comes down to.
It's a misunderstanding of the complexity of an individual in individual culture.
Right.
And even subculture of the broader culture, right? Mm-hmm. So the problem here is the marginalized group being represented in a game doesn't have the power or the control to accurately represent themselves when they're not part of the process.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you were just referring to, the barrier to entry to making these games has fallen dramatically in the last years.
That's great. That's really good.
The barrier to actually putting together a video game, or in our case, your local LARP community, or going to a convention. These are tools that are just out there that these voices can utilize, and they're just available.
Yeah. I mean, and imagine being a young Native kid playing the video games like that. We've all played video games, and imagine being a young Native kid and you're seeing yourself, some idea of your, quote, I put your culture in quotes here because the kid's probably not going to, it's not her culture, it's an idea of, quote, Native culture represented in a video game that isn't anywhere near accurate or appropriate or legitimate. And it's almost like you're looking at it as it's mocking you and mocking who you really are. Imagine how that kid feels. I mean, so being able to speak and represent your own identity from your own perspective is very powerful. And I think it's something that those of us who are settlers, we take that for granted because we are given the tools. We are given permission to speak our identities, to show who we are, to represent ourselves in all these multiple ways, and in the media, in entertainment, in movies, in books. We take it for granted that of course we are, but there's all these marginalized groups, and I tend to focus on Native Americans, but I think we can imagine Mexicans or Latin Americans.
We were talking about before we turned on the microphones about the phenomena that's going on with Black Panther.
Yes.
Which is incredible, and it should be an eye-opener to all these companies to say, like, look, this is something that people want. People want the power to tell these stories in the hands of the appropriate groups.
And look how much more interesting.
More
And look how much more interesting it was. Wakanda is a fabulous, fascinating, amazing, admirable place. Like, I want to go there. We were talking about, like, I want to go there.
And just every element of the storytelling in the visuals of that film, too, is teaching you about Africa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's so many opportunities to do all this stuff.
And dismantling the stereotypes that we all have. Like, oh, well, Africa is a poor place. They have no culture. They have no science. They have no, right? These are the assumptions that we as Americans have. Yeah. And that movie, like, dismantled it piece, and water, even though it's from a comic book and all that, but it actually took those cultural stereotypes and dismantled them piece by piece by piece. Yeah. Brilliant, right? When game designers who are non-native represent native peoples in their games, so that's something they're taking away from native peoples when they develop native characters without any indigenous person participating in the process. So there's two examples I wanted to bring in here that I think everybody would be able to relate to, because I know this one, the movie Avatar was heavily debated when it came out.
This is the James Cameron Avatar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I saw so many indigenous writers talking about how problematic it was, because these blue creatures were essentially, they took this broad, appropriated, misinformed concept of the Plains Indian culture and put them onto blue creatures, right? The riding, the way they were represented is basically what our stereotype idea of the Plains culture, Plains Indians. Right. And then I saw a lot of people, usually non-native, pushing back against that, saying, no, it's beautiful, it's brilliant, it's empathetic. And I was like, oh God, it's a hard hill to climb when you have a movie that is so beautifully made. Mm-hmm. The CGI blows you away, and the story is interesting, and these beautiful characters, and you want to admire them, and yet it was taking, right? It was taking, and there were no indigenous peoples involved in that story development or design or process. Mm-hmm. So, and another thing more close to your guys' heart, maybe, the video game Age of Empires.
Yes.
And I was reading about it recently, and I've played games similar, like Civilization. Mm-hmm. And a game like that focuses the player's attention on discovering, or, quote, claiming land on a map. And that action, that process, that game system process, right, it reinforces a colonial view of the world, where there is this dominant group that's coming in and taking. And even if you look, and I think it's Age of Empires, and I know Civilization, I think the Iroquois were represented. They would never, ever have been able to develop the technology necessary to win that game. Like that, so it's automatically a group that is put in a position where they don't have, you know how every group starts with like some skill sets and some benefits? Yeah. That group starts almost at a deficit. And it's the game is designed that way. So when I say about game mechanics and design and system structure, that's what I mean. You get an indigenous person involved in the design development of those characters, you're going to have a different set of skills that actually might end up being competitive, really competitive, in the broader game system. Right. So, but you don't have that because of the assumptions that these game designers have. So they're just going to create this trope of a native character, and they're obviously never going to win the game. So those are two examples. And then, you know, the idea of what can we do, we always talk about this on our Inside 254 podcast. We always end each show with activist action. So I just want to throw, this doesn't mean the conversation has to end here, but like the actions I want to encourage your listeners. So for game designers who might be listening, if you're a game designer, there is a, and you can look it up on the internet. It's a skins workshop. It's something like Game Design Skins Workshop or something. It's up in Canada, and it's for Indigenous game designers to go and learn about video game development. And there are some games that are out there that have been designed by people that have gone through this workshop. So the argument for game design companies to say, well, there aren't any, right? Mm-hmm. No, there are. Oh, yeah. And you just need to do a little bit more research to find them, but they are there. So the first thing for game designers is to work toward cultural collaboration instead of doing what you're doing now, and seek out and work with Indigenous game designers to embed Indigenous representation more accurately in the story, the system, and the game mechanics.
And more broadly, I know we're speaking to your specialty with Indigenous people, but this, of course, goes to any culture.
Yes,
Yeah.
especially any culture that is in a more marginalized position in America, in North America, in the world. Right. So if we're talking especially about, but it could just be cultures in general, but I'm talking specifically about the taking from what are typically marginalized groups and using it for your own benefit. And so there's a way to adjust and make it more interesting, right? And do it better. And then there's 2 suggestions for players. So if you're a player of a game, contact your favorite game company. You probably have a favorite game, and whether it has an Indigenous person or another culture represented or not, but contact that company, tweet at them, write to them on Facebook, write an email, and ask them to hire Indigenous game designers. I mean, so that kind of groundswell of sort of grassroots simple activism, if there's enough people writing to Electronic Arts and saying, would you please hire... They might actually listen at some point and hire someone. And also the second thing is to play games by Indigenous designers. So I have 2 suggestions. One is called Thunderbird Strike. It's a 2D side scroller, very simple, only 3 levels, but it's fun. It's your phone, your iPad, your computer. And it was designed by Anishinaabe designer Elizabeth LaPensée. And it's free. So it's for everyone. It's free to download. And then the other game, well, there's also a game called, quote, Invaders, which is a native spin on the classic arcade Space Invaders. So it's totally playing with the idea of colonialism. It's look that up. And then finally, the game called Never Alone. And it was designed by Upper One Games, but it was designed in development with the Cook Inlet Tribal Council in order to embed Inupiat principles such as coexistence between humans and wildlife, respect for nature and elders, community, and spiritual connection to land.
I think I've actually heard of that one. I think that was developed for a museum exhibit.
I think it might have been, but it's available. It's neveralonegame.com, and you can download it.
I'm trying to remember because there was I think the YouTube show is called Extra Credits. It just talks about video games and all sorts of elements there too, and they occasionally do a series called Games You Might Not Have Tried. And awesome. I think that was one of the games that was highlighted in that series. The only way I know about that.
It's absolutely beautiful too. Even if you go and just look at the neveralonegame.com website and look at the artwork, and that's the same thing for Thunderbird Strike. Elizabeth LaPensée actually hand drew everything in that game.
Yeah.
So it's to me, these games are not just more accurately representing Indigenous identities.
And that's actually something...
But it's also pieces of art.
Right. That is something that is becoming a little bit more common, I believe. I'm see if I can come up with any specific examples that I can think of, but in board game design, video game design, there's a push towards systems and mechanics that show you something different or take a different take on things. You're talking about how what's usually referred to as area control, where you're claiming land and things like this, reinforces a colonial idea. Well, then there's also games that are economic based, and they reinforce these different ideas that are in various cultures. But not every culture worked that way. There are games that involve bartering and any number of other elements that have been a part of someone's culture.
Right.
There's ways to show that through mechanics and design. We know that because they did it in real life. There's a way to
That's
do
right.
it.
So wouldn't it be more... I just feel like it would be so much more interesting to have more games, in this case, with those ideas. Because when I played Thunderbird Strike, it was really fun getting to be the Thunderbird, right? This mythological Anishinaabe creature whose power is you're powered by lightning in the clouds, and then you come down and you're zapping all these nasty oil pipeline snakes and construction equipment, and you're destroying their development, and at the same time you get to re-energize and reinvigorate herds of elk and buffalo, and you're working to it's a simple 2D side scroller, but it's got these little, I guess the cut scenes are really interesting, and the music is by an Indigenous group. I mean, it's like this whole experience. So I feel like gaming, and then I come back to the idea of Wakanda, right? Yeah. that is a world I would love to inhabit as a game, as like a real person. Like that's so much more interesting than this colonialist mindset that we've had and we've been fed through every method that our culture feeds this to us. Education, the news. I mean, when's the last time you saw a story about an indigenous people or person or story on like CNN or MSNBC or in the New York Times? You just don't.
You don't
hear about these people, and they're here, and they make beautiful, amazing things. I mean, I don't want to essentialize them. They're also complicated, and they do, they have their tribal issues with their governments, and there's things like disenrollment, and there's stuff, but we are essentializing them to the point where we're saying they are this one thing. They are what? Pocahontas. They are Tonto. They are this, right? Yeah. They are not that. Yeah. Let them be more complex. Let them say who they are. Yeah. Let us enjoy their stories and the way they see their world on their terms. It's not a threat.
Yeah, no, and I think that's exactly why I think we have that barrier, is because people see whether it's change, whether it's something new, people, rather than try to be open-minded and embrace that, they see it automatically, they fear it, they see it as a threat, and then they try to push it down.
So,
that's I think that's one of the big barriers that we have.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Was it? I think it was during the filming of Dances with Wolves, which a movie I know you are a huge fan.
Yeah.
One of the things that ended up,
full disclosure, I like it too.
Yeah.
I understand the problems with it, but I still it's a beautifully made film.
So one of my things that I believe, we were watching like a documentary about it, and they needed to teach people to speak, Native American languages.
Right.
I don't remember.
It was Sioux.
The Sioux language.
Lakota.
Yep.
Thank you. I just know I don't know.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay, right.
But so one of the things that ended up happening was they actually found people, the very few that were left that they could find, to come and teach this language. And we were just listening to your most recent episode a little bit before.
Talking about languages.
Yeah. Talking about the whole idea of like these languages are disappearing.
They're dying. That's right.
It's not just through games, it's through all sorts of media that if we build up these people, whoever they might be, there's aspects that are being lost in this world from the minimization.
Yeah.
It's important to preserve culture because these are lessons that have been learned in different ways that can inform us as we grow. It's the whole idea of like, read everything you can get your hands on, learn as much as you can, will make you a better person. Yeah. Closing your mind to ideas and to philosophies and ways of looking at the world. Like, you can stick to your philosophy and your beliefs, but be open to understanding what other people's are is like a huge message that seems so much in like...
It gets lost. That message gets lost in going, taking us back to games. Like, it's like the actual playing of the game, you kind of take yourself out, you suspend disbelief because you want to actually enjoy this game and be entertained, and you completely miss all of the nuances in the game, whether they be good or bad. You just completely dismiss it. Like we were actually, we were talking earlier, about a couple of different games, and like for example, World of Warcraft. I love that game. I've played that game for many years. I had to stop playing not too long ago because again, it's a huge time sink, and it becomes a job after a while playing that game. As good as it is, it's just like, no, I have to put that away. But I love that game. I love playing that game, and it did not register to me for the longest time. Like one of the races in the game is they're called the Tauren. They're like these huge, bulls and cows, right? And they have that Native American aspect to them, and it completely, I just completely didn't register it until I just really, I don't even remember when it was. I just sat down and I looked and I was like, they're living in teepees, they have totems, it is clearly they clearly
I'll give you a hint, guys.
Yeah.
As soon as you start recognizing things like that,
right,
and you start really seeing it, like if you start looking for it, now that you know, start looking for it, you will see it everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, when I say everywhere, from product design, labels, clothing,
I mean,
even TV shows. Like, I just watched an episode of the new Trading Spaces, and they freaking designed a room with goddamn green dream catchers. These people were not native. They were like, I'm like, you just completely disconnected the dream catcher from what it really is supposed to be in the Anishinaabe culture. What are you doing? Oh my God. So what I'm saying is, this will happen. It happens to my students. Every semester I teach this. As soon as you start recognizing it and start being aware and being willing to see it, you'll see it everywhere. And then all of a sudden you're overwhelmed because you're like, oh my God, it's everywhere. Yeah. It's everywhere you look.
Well, remember, the reason that all these ideas get minimized and simplified is to make them communicable. It's easier to think of the idea of what a Native American is, in broad, inaccurate terms.
Right.
Yeah,
we simplify it. Yeah, let's simplify it for you.
But which one of us would like our identities? Right, but which one of us would like our identities simplified like that?
Yeah. Nobody.
No, and that's the thing, is you turn it on yourself and you realize whatever your background, whatever your identity is, how would you like me to come along and say, I don't care what you say, who you say you are, and what your identity is. I'm going to tell you who you are. And by the way, I'm going to tell you you're a one-dimensional individual with only this aspect.
Oh, yeah.
You would get angry, right? You'd be like, oh, excuse me, you don't have the right. Well, right, we assume because we're settlers. We're in that settler category. We take for granted that nobody's going to do that to us.
Yeah.
I mean,
we don't like it. Why would they?
I think I have a different perspective also because even as a teenager, I would go into stores and instantly be, security would follow me around. And then I went into the military, came out of the military, and I would do the same thing. And I would actually stop the security guards and I'd say, hey, listen, you see that guy over there? He's actually shoplifting. Stop following me around. And I'd have to do this. And then I'm going to bring it back to games within the LARP community. Like, there have been instances where folks have actually said to my face, like, I would get upset over something, like something legitimate. And people would actually say to my face, well, you're Latin, you have that hot blood. You'll get... And I just... kind of look at like, did you really just say that to my face?
Yeah. Well, you must be getting angry because of that, right? That assumption that, like, well, clearly, and no.
Clearly, my blood gives me this thing where it's like I wish it was a superpower. Where, like, it got me mad, and I could actually lift buses over my head.
Mr. Furious.
Mr. Furious, yeah.
So I think another good example that's probably a touchstone to anyone that is listening to our show is what it means to be a nerd or a gamer. That's something that has changed in the past couple of decades, but
it's no longer as stigmatized as it was. Right. Like, when I grew up, I came up in the 80s, right? Yeah. The guys, the people, the guys and the girls that I knew growing up, they played D&D. They were ostracized.
They were worshiping
right?
Satan, of course.
They were ostracized for a variety of reasons. Either you're worshiping Satan or, you nerd, you geek. Now, thank goodness, gaming culture as a culture, right? Yeah. Gaming is a culture now, and it's more accepted, and you've got all these amazing, conventions and things that people go to, and the cosplay and all this wonderful stuff.
And it has
it's different.
It's good points and its negative points. Right. There's toxicity in the community, and there's great creativity in the community.
The positive thing, though,
it's not a simple idea,
right?
Of this.
But I think the good thing here is that this community, gaming as a practice, as an action, as a commodity, as a culture, as a subculture, can evolve. So there should be nothing frightening about the idea of saying, well, let's take a game like Age of Empires or Civilization or World of Warcraft and revise those characters that have indigenous identities. Revise them in consultation and collaboration with an indigenous designer. Get their ideas, get their stories, get their life ways and their beliefs and their processes and their principles, and embed them in that character, right? That race, that whatever. There should be nothing frightening about that. That actually should be completely achievable, and it should be something that the gaming community wants, because the gaming community, I hope, remembers when it was ostracized in the broader culture, and nobody wants that. Nobody wants to be looked at as this one single stereotype.
Right.
And there's simple things that I know have happened for major companies. So just as we're talking about this, I know I was talking to you about some of the things that Wizards of the Coast has done with Magic over the years. In the original, I think it was in alpha or beta Magic, there was a card that on it had a picture of a pentagram or a pentacle. That is a real religious symbol. There is now a very reasonable rule in design within Wizards of the Coast that says, hey, don't use real-world iconography that is related to a religion, a people, whatever. Like, we can't do that. That's bad.
Well, and I would say to the Wizards of the Coast, if you're going to do that, how about go find a Wiccan and have somebody who's Wiccan participate in the design, getting the story, getting a more complex and dynamic version instead of just picking and taking.
Yeah,
right?
or if that
Nothing wrong with that.
If that trope or idea was your starting point, okay, go to someone from that culture and have them develop it into what it can be to not be a trope.
Right. Complicate it a little bit.
Yeah,
Complication should not be a scary thing. I know in our culture it kind of like, oh my God, it made it. And I say this too: embrace the mess. Embrace the mess. No, it's not clear. Everybody likes silos. Everybody likes compartments because then you can label people. It's easy.
Yeah.
But messiness is more. It's more frustrating, but it's also more fun, more dynamic, more interesting. And isn't that great? I mean, I just want to bring one more comment from Elizabeth's LaPensée's article that I mentioned, and she says, quote, "It is important for game developers not to ignore the historical fact that Indigenous people have often been denied the power, status, and authority to tell their own stories." So as an idea going forward, I think if we can all agree, and if game designers would embrace this and players would embrace it and apply that pressure to companies who are making games, little moves, little ripples in the pond, this change can happen. It is achievable today. But the first step, of course, is recognizing that it's a problem.
Yeah. All right. So I'm gonna be average gamer who I love these games. I'm listening to this show, and you're making these really great points. But now I'm really concerned because I think I'm a good person, and I
this isn't about you not being a good person.
Am I wrong to still enjoy these games because of all of the cultural appropriation? Like what do I do? I mean, I know you gave me some actions, but say I do that. Do I just stop playing these games?
No, I wouldn't stop playing the games. I would maybe another thing you could do is actually pay more attention when you're playing it to see where maybe those problematic areas of taking are, and where maybe some of those one-dimensional stereotypes are being relied on. Recognize it, maybe bring it to your friends' attention. Broaden out the net of awareness. That's a really good thing you can do. Does that mean you have to throw your games away? No. Like I said, I mean, I recognize how problematic Dances with Wolves is. I still own it.
Yeah.
I still watch it every now and then, although my enjoyment of it has diminished a bit because I know how problematic it is. So, do I refuse to watch it? No. But my enjoyment of it has diminished a bit because I see where the problems are. Yeah. So now that's why the next part is try to gravitate toward games that are including native designers. And they do exist, and there's a I don't know his name, I'm sorry, but there is a Lakota game designer who is working on. If you read the article that I mentioned, it's mentioned in there.
We'll put
the link in there. But so, in other words, Elizabeth is doing scholarship on this. She's also writing publicly about this. She's designing games. So she even has a video on Vimeo. I think it's called Native Representations in Video Games, where she goes through all of these different games that you guys would know. And I'm like, I think she mentioned Red Dead Revolver and Red Dead Redemption and some of these other. But there's all these. She goes through them all, and I think World of Warcraft is one of them. But she's actually identified in this article some of the native game designers who are out there working on sort of mainstream games.
Oh, okay.
Oh yeah, so that's what I'm saying is I'm not an expert. She is, and that's why I keep bringing her up because she's written. She's written extensively. I mean, she just got a Guggenheim to do development of another game.
Great.
So I mean, there are people out there who are having these conversations who are trying to complicate the nature of game design, and so doing a little bit of research as a player. If you see there's a game that you really want to play, but you're like, oh god, that looks like there's some kind of noble savage. Okay, look, do a little bit of research before you buy the game. don't just put your money into the company's hands. Do a little bit of research, and if you're trying to be a little bit more, ethical, I would say, and support Indigenous designers, buy one of their games, but look into the mainstream game that you want to see if any of those designers are Indigenous and participating. And let me tell you something, it's kind of hard to find that. Yeah. It's going to be a little bit of work. Yeah. But if you decide that that's not something that you want to keep contributing to all the time, and right now it's hard because not every game has an Indigenous designer or a representative of their culture, right? So this is why the pressure applied to these companies is so essential. Right. But you can do a little bit of research to be a more mindful consumer of games. You can.
And I think it's important to, you're highlighting that these are ripples.
Yes.
This is an action leading forward. We're not going to snap our fingers, obviously, and change this. An example, again, to
little
jump
moves.
back to...
Little moves.
Just jumping back to cinema. It wasn't that long ago that a person of any minority would legitimately get on screen. This is where the idea of minstrelsism comes from.
That's right.
This is not that long ago.
Within the last 100 years.
But
look at what we have now.
Now we have Black Panther.
Look at how it changed. And you're right. These things don't happen in a vacuum.
Yeah.
And they are not discrete moments. All of these moments are connected. Every little action you take, every time you tell a friend, when you play World of Warcraft, that race, it's a little problematic for this reason. And you don't have to get all scholarly on them. Just give them a basic explanation, and now you've opened their eyes. Now, whether they're willing to have their eyes open is another story. What I always tell my students is, you go, like what you always tell me about labor organizing. You have your 1s, your 2s, your 3s, and your 4s, right?
Yeah.
So your friends who are the 1s and the 2s are the ones who are open-minded, and they're really interested, and they're sort of look like you guys are looking at me like, I had no idea. Oh my God, this is fascinating. We need to fix this. Great. Talk to them about that. Get them to try and help you, do a little Twitter campaign, or, do some of this. Get the game.
Build awareness.
Build awareness. Start playing Indigenous designers games, start being a little more mindful about what you're purchasing and who you're playing with and all that stuff. But then you get your 3s and your 4s. The 3s are a little more of an uphill battle. The 4s, don't even bother. That 4s would be, the parent who's, I don't care what anybody tells. Well, then just don't even bother having the conversation, because you're just going to be banging your head against the wall. So you make these little moves within the scope of your world, and people individually can have a much bigger impact on something like this, I think, than maybe they realize. Because even just talking about it like this to your friends and the people in the gaming community, that alone shifts the conversation. And then, like what you're talking about, now we see Black Panther didn't just come about. Right? It was all these conversations and actions and little moves for decades, and all of a sudden not all of a sudden, but now it seems like all of a sudden we have this renaissance of cool stories from marginalized groups. That shit didn't just happen. That's That's every single one of us having those little shifts, those little moments.
Yeah, because I will say,
makes a difference.
I'm glad you touched on something with the 1 through 4s. The 4s you don't touch on, because when we put this out to some of the communities that we were doing the show, and we wanted to hear what they said, we had a few people who said, "Oh, we've actually we have communities online, like forums and things like that, where we talk." But in one of the comments I specifically remember was, she was extremely upset because she tried to have this conversation with someone on a forum, and they were like, take your social justice out of my games. I just want to have fun. But the reality is, it is the fun is part of our culture. It's part of everything that we do. So you can't just ignore a part of the culture and say, oh no, this we're just going to put to the side, and we can do whatever we want with this, but everything else we have to. It's okay,
Well, and I would push back and say, yeah, but what if you complicate the story a little bit more and allow that race of creature or whatever, or a character to be more complex and a little more dynamic? What if it makes the game more fun? Right? I mean, why are we assuming deficit? Why don't we assume benefit, adding to, not taking away.
Right.
So something else
That's crazy. That's, I mean, almost that's crazy to me.
It is.
Something else that just popped into my head is not just necessarily, we're talking about, cultural representation. In the Forgotten Realms, in D&D, one of the predominant D&D settings, there is a race that is predominantly evil. They are ebony black-skinned with white hair,
Right.
and they live in caves underground.
Oh,
And they're called Drow or Dark Elves, and that's been something for
that's
years.
all you need to know about.
Yep.
Okay, and already you're saying, ooh.
You see my face. I'm like,
yeah.
oh, here we go. Like, oh, the evil dark people. Oh my goodness, run away and hide. Oh.
And then you look at things like Josie, our DM. She is a writer for role-playing games specifically around Call of Cthulhu, Lovecraft. And Lovecraft, if you read Lovecraft's fiction, it's incredibly xenophobic. It's always these savage, backward cultures that are in touch with this evil, unknowable horror of the universe.
And we still love you, Joe. Like that.
Yeah,
This doesn't take away from your writing or anything.
No, it's this is
Lovecraft.
This is an element of Lovecraft,
Right?
And it's built on that, And you have to take a step back and realize, okay, I see what's going on here. Recognizing that is an important step.
Right.
Yeah, I would say recognizing it, and I'm gonna push a little bit and say maybe it's time to stop developing games based on Lovecraft. Mm-hmm. I mean, I realize that there are people doing this, so there are probably ways to shift that story and shift that narrative in a way that makes it maybe even more dynamic and interesting and gets away from some of those
I would actually
xenophobic, basic, sort of colonialist ideas.
Well,
I would
say I think that is something that's actually going on.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think it's kind of lazy to keep relying on these old writers and old stories. There are other stories to tell and new ways to do it. Why would anybody want to shy away from the opportunity to develop something even more dynamic and interesting?
I believe what's actually going on is people that have developed games around Lovecraftian horror are taking those, that unknowable cosmic element of this unknowable, terrifying thing, and that's what they're focusing on.
Yeah.
And they're moving the idea of those games away from those more negative aspects.
Yeah.
And
that's wonderful.
That seems to be another good thing that we can do. We can recognize these things in our games and we can remove them. I know very recently there's been a push in some of our local gaming circles to address the idea that, again, we're talking about tropes, that you'll have the traveling mystical gypsies.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. Or
that's a problem.
Even you can even go so far as to say the term barbarian is bad, or use it if we really want to get into it, an assassin.
Yeah.
All of these come from
sure.
derogatory terms.
Yeah.
This exists. This is ubiquitous to the point that some of this, the word assassin, just means what it means now. Its root comes from just everyone in that country over there are murderers.
Yeah.
That's originally what it meant. It just happened that assassin was the name.
I think it's really comfortable for all of us to look through essentializing lenses. It just really is. It's easier. Mm-hmm. Right? It's the same argument as why I hear people say they don't want to teach their, grade schoolers more complicated stories about Native peoples because it'll upset them. Well, sometimes the truth is upsetting, and sometimes the stories, again, that doesn't mean you have to depress people, but you can provide, a more dynamic version of the person, the culture, the nation, the identity. And that, I don't know, that to me, it shouldn't be scary, the idea of doing that. It really shouldn't be. So if you take the idea of a gypsy or an assassin, I mean, can we not apply our collective imaginations to imagining a new way of a new imagining of this particular type?
Right.
If you want to type, create a tweaked, more dynamic type that maybe takes some of those elements, but makes them a little more complicated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or just take something what is it that you liked about that quote-unquote gypsy idea?
Mm-hmm.
Is it the soothsaying element? Is it,
Anybody can do that.
Is it the traveling element?
Right.
Is it...
Anybody can do that too. Why does it specifically have to be racial in that
Right.
culture, right?
Right.
It's exactly what, and we've seen that a lot in games. Like that's where a lot of games that we're interested in, they're moving towards that. Like D&D with Wizards of the Coast, they've been moving up for years. They've realized like a lot of the issues with like their settings, some of their settings, and they've moved towards it. It's like, okay, you can be this and you don't have to be from that setting anymore. That's not specific to that culture.
And I would say while you're saying that, I'm thinking it also doesn't mean continuing the erasure by leaving them out. Right. So I would never advocate for leaving out an Indigenous character in a game. I would advise that the game designing company seek out an Indigenous designer to incorporate an Indigenous character that is more interesting, more dynamic, less stereotypical, less appropriated based on false information. In other words, it's economic too.
Yeah.
Right?
So let me ask this sort of, we keep referring to finding an Indigenous designer. We're really just talking about incorporating people with first-hand knowledge of that culture. That designer could be a scholar from that culture.
Absolutely.
Or someone from, a museum.
Comics.
Or
music.
All kinds of
cultural
places.
directors. Every nation has its cultural directors.
Yeah, right.
I mean, like you can.
Sometimes people get hung up on labels. Just saying a designer, like anyone that is helping
No, you're right.
to make a game, is a designer just by the action of helping.
Well, like the idea of Never Alone, the game Never Alone, they didn't work with an Indigenous game designer. I'm just saying that because there are a lot of them out there now, and I don't think people know that, and I think you should know. But you could just, in consultation with the nation, like with the cultural center of the nation, that would be enough.
Because I believe that's how that particular game.
Yeah, it is. That's the tribal council actually consulted with that company.
Yeah, it's almost like people want to embrace their own culture and share it.
Yeah. Imagine that.
Yeah.
Who'd have thunk?
It's like you were mentioning in your episode, we mentioned it a little bit earlier, there's scholarly organizations out there that you never really knew because you never looked for them. It's that same adage, if you go on the internet, you can find anything.
Yeah.
There's people that have specific scholarly backgrounds that can teach you about these things. And they, as I'm sure you can speak to firsthand, learned about this by going to those people.
Yes.
Yes. And I think that's going to ultimately be to the benefit of the gaming culture. I mean, it's really going.
I agree.
It really, the fact that folks aren't doing more of it. I mean, I know that they are in our circles, but that's what we want to know. We want to make sure that folks who are listening to this episode really they get it. He's like, if they didn't know something, they learned something. If they didn't know how to take that next step, maybe we gave them a little extra information to give them that push. Like that's my.
I want to ask you something too.
Go ahead.
Because we're talking about game design. Well, isn't the idea of a LARP, can't just anybody create one of these? People who've created them.
Oh, yeah.
So within that, is there...
If we can do it, then we can.
What I'm saying is, are there LARPs out there that incorporate Indigenous characters in a more accurate, interesting, dynamic way? And if not, how about some of you LARP designers out there? Go do the research. Go communicate with the Lenape Nation in New Jersey or wherever you're listening. Find the tribal nation that's near you and work with them to develop some Indigenous characters that would be fun for people to play and a little more accurate and dynamic and it's not based on a stereotype. I mean, that's something. I feel like that would be an easy thing to do. I'm looking at you, is that easy or not? I mean, I don't know how easy it is to create one of these games.
It depends on how far you want to go.
Yeah.
So as you're asking, are there these opportunities out there? We spoke with a friend of ours on an episode that hasn't aired at the time of recording, where she talks about going to a game in Sweden, where it was based in historic World War II, in this cultural site that still looks like it did back then.
Yeah.
They lived a week with no villain to fight, but the Nazis were just patrolling. They had taken over the town, and you were worried about rationing, and you were given like your ration like they had, like the people that lived in that town.
Yeah,
you lived
you were
as
given
one of
papers.
those townsfolk,
Yep.
and the whole idea of it was to bring that historical moment to life for these people.
Oh man.
Yeah. So there's actually some really cool stuff that goes on in Europe. Like you can actually get government grants to do stuff like that.
That's amazing. I'm just thinking like some of the different actual historical realities, some of the battles, some of the things that have happened with Indigenous peoples over the years.
Yeah, I mean,
actually create like taking a moment and creating a game around that,
right.
so that people could step into that moment and feel what it was might have been like.
Yeah,
that would be really powerful.
Yeah.
So, some people put a big, no, these are two different things, barrier between reenactment and LARPing. And they are. They're two distinct ideas, but there are elements out there that really blow the line, like the one that I was just alluding to.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, and when you're talking about culture and culture shock, like there's been a huge movement, I want to say in the last 5 to 6 years, where a lot of folks, maybe even longer, I want to say maybe even a decade, where folks have learned that a lot of these possibilities from European nations, like, from Norway, from Finland, from England, from France, from Spain, like they do LARPing very differently than we do in America. And one of the things that I've heard a lot has been, Americans can't do that because of the way our culture is, right?
There's
Specifically,
some legal restrictions as well.
There's some legal restrictions, but specifically what I'm talking about is how, the mindset, American mindset won't work for a game like this. So for specifically, because when we actually spoke, this was Erica that we had spoken with. When we talked to her about it, there is an American mentality that if you play a game, there is a goal to win that game, not experience something, right? Where the game that she played, when you go to this game, you are very specifically told, yes, this is a game, it has game elements, but it's about the story, and by participating, you have to understand that is the goal of this game, is not to win, but to participate in the story. And it's going to be very difficult to translate that to Americans because of that cultural mentality that we have.
But you just said Americans. You don't need all 300 some million Americans to buy in. You need a handful of people to go, let's try this. Right. And then they tell their friends, and then they tell their friends, and then they tell their friends, and right? So that's how culture shifts.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen overnight in one big quantum change, like, boom, here we're different. It's little moments, conversations, sharing information, trying things.
Right.
Because there's always people who want to try something different. And it can happen.
But there's always groups organizing and rallying around these ideas. So there's a rotating, it rotates between a couple of European countries, and the name of the convention changes depending on which country it's in, but it's most commonly known as Knightepunk. And it's a scholarly event to come together and talk about freeform games, live-action role-playing games, and like how to develop them, how to do them better, to address the sort of nitty-gritty aspects of it. What does it mean for someone to really invest themselves emotionally into a role-play scenario? And when do we need to be responsible with each other to say, like, okay, this needs to stop?
Right.
Depending on what your subject matter is. Like I said, it moves around. But now there's, my understanding is the Living Game Conference here in the U.S. Is doing the same thing. It's taking these bigger ideas that are, more readily embraced in Europe and bringing them here to the U.S. and developing it.
Right.
A friend of ours, Lizzie Stark, I first met her at a game convention because she had just discovered this idea of LARPing, but was not a gamer. She's a writer. And she was going to enter the community, and up front was just like, yeah, I'm writing a book about this. She has since gone on to become a game designer herself. I believe she was part of a collaboration. I want to say the name of it was #Feminism.
I think it was.
Where it was all women designers making feminist empowering.
That's
games.
awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I love it.
And it was also, she's like, I've not actually gotten to look at the product yet, but there's simple games in it, like taking like movie titles and then just replacing one word with like, you know, vagina.
How fun!
Some of it's things like that. Just become comfortable with a word.
Yeah, exactly. Retrain your brain.
Yeah,
I mean that's basically what we're talking about here. Is the retrain? We need to all of us individually, when we're looking at the games that we love, when we're looking at the movies that we love, when we're looking at those products that we're so familiar with and so comfortable with, just be a little more critical and skeptical and question, like, does this seem accurate or does this seem one-dimensional? And how would I feel if I was represented one-dimensionally? That doesn't feel very good. And maybe have a little bit of, a human level empathy on that and just be more aware. And then, if you're comfortable, take some of those extra steps, right?
Yeah.
To take action to try and create a little bit of a ripple, the conversation, shift it just a little bit.
Yeah, because...
And that's a good thing.
Oh,
yeah, we don't all start as fully formed beings. We're not experts at everything just because I found out about it. Like, it takes a lot of learning.
Oh, yeah.
But all
Yes,
these
it
things,
does.
all the learning you can do is only going to improve your understanding.
That's right. And hopefully improve your enjoyment. Now, I will admit, like I said with Dances with Wolves, my enjoyment of watching that film, I don't reach for it all the time because I know I'm just going to be rolling my eyes through half of it. Because my awareness is such that and my husband always says to me, can't you just watch the movie? And like, I can't anymore. No. So once you have that lens, it never really goes away and you can try to put it on hold, but it's always kind of there. So back to your, in theory, your hypothetical gamer who's just like, what does that mean? I got to throw my games away. No, but every time you play that game, now you're going to be looking sort of squint-eyed at that character going, yeah, that's a little bit of a problem. Or the storyline where you're like, yeah, that's a little too simplistic. And that's okay. I mean, you might find your enjoyment of the game diminished. And if that's the case, maybe sell it on Let Go and go find another game.
Yeah.
And that's okay too.
Or dare I say, being a designer just means you put some creativity into the process.
Right.
I could take Monopoly and make my own new rule for it, and suddenly I'm making a hack of Monopoly.
I love
that's
that.
a brand new game.
Mm-hmm.
I could
Genius.
I can maybe recognize this is a problematic element. How can I make it not a problematic element?
Mm-hmm.
Like we were talking about with games based in Lovecraft, we can move away from the negative, stereotypical things that are in it into just this sort of idea of like, okay, now it's a conspiracy game, and where the conspiracy is these unknowable horrors.
Right.
Like, you can do that.
Yeah, one of the wonderful things about, I think, games and writing and art, you can do anything.
Mm-hmm.
It really is just you're limited only by your imagination and the will to change.
Right.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
these are opportunities that we all have. So go out there, learn about these things, learn about all these different great cultures, number one. Whatever you might be seeing, a trope of, learn a little something about that. Make that knowledge known.
Google is your friend.
Yeah, interact with that game design company and say, hey, I saw this in your game. I was a little, let down by it. When I engage with it, now I handle it this way. What do you think of that?
Yeah. I'm gonna actually put out something. I'm going to ask anyone that is listening to this who runs conventions. I'm going to put this out there to you. I'm going to ask you to actually maybe reach out to some of these folks and maybe have them do some panels at your convention, or maybe bring their games to the convention to actually share with folks.
Because I love that. Both those ideas are great.
Because I think that's going to make a big difference. Because sometimes gamers, and again, being from the gaming community, we know sometimes folks are a little hesitant to actually put themselves out there, well, even on social media.
Yeah, and vice versa. Just like we're learning about some of these communities and organizations are out there that we never knew about, they don't know about us necessarily either.
Right, exactly. Or they might have gotten such resistance from other convention runners that they don't know how open and friendly your convention is and that you're absolutely willing to invite them to do stuff. So please, I would start with
Elizabeth LaPensée.
Yes.
and then she knows a lot of people and the things that she's written and spoken about and the videos she has out. Start with her. So for conventions and game designing companies, start with her and then go from there because she's into that world. She does scholarship in it. She writes writes it, she designs the games. Good starting point.
Yeah, even if you get these people to show up to every convention, gaming convention all over the U.S. or all over the world every time, you'll still get some great communication from them.
Yeah.
You'll be able to spread a lot of better knowledge.
Yeah, and if they can't specifically be there, maybe they can actually get you their games, point you in the right direction, say, hey, I won't be there, but here's the game that I developed or I consulted on or whatever. I really think the gamers in your convention would love this game. And then already you're starting the process.
All these are great suggestions. Because what you're suggesting and building on what we've been talking about is changing the conversation at every level.
Yep.
So it's not just the players, it's not just the game designers, it's not just the conventioners, it's every single level, right?
Yeah.
And as soon as you start doing that, that's where you're going to see change really happening and beneficial.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because we're moving away from the trope of the sit there and do nothing people into the nuanced learning about a subject and getting involved with it.
Yeah, I did a thing! Yeah!
Take some action.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to speak up and speak out.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, Amanda. This was really great.
Yeah, this has been a fantastic conversation.
But
Thank you for sharing your expertise with us.
Yes, I have
You're welcome, and thank you.
I as always learn something every time we do these old man yells at the sky. Like I learned something. My rant is going to be amazing, I think, when I actually do it. But yeah, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you again for inspiring this conversation because it was totally you.
I'm so glad. Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, and with that, in case this happens to be where we end the episode, we've been Old Man and Skinny Guy.
I'm Old Man.
I'm the Skinny Guy. We'll catch you next time.
And remember, don't dream it, be it. Take care.